Thank you for joining for another episode of Rob Anderson Overnight. The second part of a reading of the Wikipedia article on the African theologian Augustine of Hippo, focused on the philosopher and theologian's views and thought. We wish to thank the fine folks at Wikipedia for producing such quality content. Please support Wikipedia and their noble program. And now, our reading.
Views and thought. Augustine's large contribution of writings covered diverse fields including theology, philosophy and sociology. Along with John Chrysostom, Augustine was among the most prolific scholars of the early church, by quantity of surviving writings. Theology, Christian anthropology. Augustine was one of the first Christian ancient Latin authors with a very clear vision of theological anthropology. He saw the human being as a perfect unity of two substances, soul and body. In his late treatise titled, On Care to Behead for the Dead, he exhorted to respect the body, on the grounds that it belonged to the very nature of the human person. Augustine's favorite figure to describe body-soul unity is marriage, caro tua, coniunx tua, your body is your wife. Initially, the two elements were in perfect harmony. After the fall of humanity, they are now experiencing dramatic combat between one another. They are two categorically different things. The body is a three-dimensional object composed of the four elements, whereas the soul has no spatial dimensions. Soul is a kind of substance, participating in reason, fit for ruling the body. Augustine was not preoccupied, as Plato and Descartes were, with going too much into details in efforts to explain the metaphysics of the soul-body union. It was enough for him to admit that they are metaphysically distinct. To be a human is to be a composite of soul and body, and the soul is superior to the body. The latter statement is grounded in his hierarchical classification of things into those that merely exist, those that exist and live, and those that exist, live, and of intelligence or reason. Like other church fathers such as Athenagoras, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria and Basil of Caesarea, Augustine vigorously condemned the practice of induced abortion, and although he disapproved of an abortion during any stage of pregnancy, he made a distinction between early abortions and later ones. He acknowledged the distinction between formed and unformed fetuses mentioned in the Septuagint translation of Exodus 21, which is considered as wrong translation of the word harm from the original Hebrew text as form in the Greek Septuagint, and based an Aristotelian distinction between the fetus before and after its supposed vivification, and did not classify as murder the abortion of an unformed fetus, since he thought that it could not be said with certainty that the fetus had already received a soul. Augustine held that the timing of the infusion of the soul was a mystery known to God alone. However, he considered procreation as one of the goods of marriage. Abortion figured as a means, along with drugs which cause sterility, of frustrating this good. It lay along a continuum which included infanticide as an instance of lustful cruelty or cruel lust. Augustine called the use of means to avoid the birth of a child an evil work, a reference to either abortion, or contraception, or both.
Creation, allegorical interpretations of Genesis. In City of God, Augustine rejected both the immortality of the human race proposed by pagans, and contemporary ideas of ages, such as those of certain Greeks and Egyptians, that differed from the Church's sacred writings. In the literal interpretation of Genesis, Augustine took the view that everything in the universe was created simultaneously by God, and not in 7 calendar days, as a literal interpretation of Genesis would require. He argued that the 6-day structure of creation, presented in the book of Genesis, represents a logical framework, rather than the passage of time in a physical way. It would bear a spiritual, rather than physical, meaning, which is no less literal. One reason for this interpretation is the passage in Sirach 18 verse 1, which says, "He created all things at once," which Augustine took as proof that the days of Genesis 1 had to be understood non-literally, as an additional support for describing the 6 days of creation as a heuristic device. Augustine thought that the actual event of creation would be incomprehensible by humans and therefore need to be translated. Augustine also does not envision original sin as causing structural changes in the universe, and even suggests that the bodies of Adam and Eve were already created mortal before the fall. Ecclesiology. Augustine developed his doctrine of the Church, principally in reaction to the Donatist sect. He taught that there is one Church, but that within this Church there are two realities, namely, the visible aspect, the institutional hierarchy, the Catholic sacraments, and the laity, and the invisible, the souls of those in the Church, who are either dead, sinful members or elect predestined for heaven. The former is the institutional body established by Christ on earth, which proclaims salvation and administers the sacraments, while the latter is the invisible body of the elect, made up of genuine believers from all ages, and who alone owe need to God. The Church, which is visible and societal, will be made up of wheat and tares, that is, good and wicked people, as per Matthew 13 verse 30, until the end of time. This concept countered the Donatist claim that only those in a state of grace were the true or pure Church on earth, and that priests and bishops who were not in a state of grace had no authority or ability to confer the sacraments. Augustine's ecclesiology was more fully developed in City of God. There, he conceives of the Church as a heavenly city or kingdom, ruled by love, which will ultimately triumph over all earthly empires, which are self-indulgent and ruled by pride. Augustine followed Cyprian in teaching that the bishops and priests of the Church are the successors of the apostles, and that their authority in the Church is God-given. Eschatology and other positions. Augustine originally believed in premillennialism, namely, that Christ would establish a literal 1,000-year kingdom prior to the general resurrection, but later rejected the belief, viewing it as carnal. He was the first theologian to expound a systematic doctrine of amillennialism, although some theologians and Christian historians believe his position was closer to that of modern postmillennialists. The medieval Catholic Church built its system of eschatology on Augustinian amillennialism, where Christ rules the earth spiritually through his triumphant church. During the Reformation, theologians such as John Calvin accepted amillennialism. Augustine taught that the eternal fate of the soul is determined at death, and that purgatorial fires of the intermediate state purify only those that died in communion with the Church. His teaching provided fuel for later theology. Although Augustine did not develop an independent Mariology, his statements on Mary surpass in number and depth those of other early writers. Even before the Council of Ephesus, he defended the ever Virgin Mary as the Mother of God, believing her to be full of grace, following earlier Latin writers such as Jerome, on account of her sexual integrity and innocence. Likewise, he affirmed that the Virgin Mary conceived as virgin, gave birth as virgin, and stayed virgin forever. Regarding natural knowledge and biblical interpretation, Augustine took the view that, if a literal interpretation contradicts science and our God-given reason, the biblical text should be interpreted metaphorically. While each passage of Scripture has a literal sense, this literal sense does not always mean that the Scriptures are mere history. At times they are rather an extended metaphor.
Original sin. Augustine taught that the sin of Adam and Eve was either an act of foolishness, followed by pride and disobedience to God, where that pride came first. The first couple disobeyed God, who had told them not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree was a symbol of the order of creation. Self-centeredness made Adam and Eve eat of it, thus failing to acknowledge and respect the world as it was created by God, with its hierarchy of beings and values. They would not have fallen into pride and lack of wisdom if Satan hadn't sown into their senses the root of evil. Their nature was wounded by concupiscence or libido, which affected human intelligence and will, as well as affections and desires, including sexual desire. In terms of metaphysics, concupiscence is not a being but bad quality, the privation of good, or a wound. Augustine's understanding of the consequences of original sin and the necessity of redeeming grace was developed in the struggle against Pelagius and his Pelagian disciples, Caelestius and Julian of Eclanum, who had been inspired by Rufinus of Syria, a disciple of Theodore of Mopsuestia. They refused to agree that original sin wounded human will and mind, insisting that the human nature was given the power to act, to speak, and to think when God created it. Human nature cannot lose its moral capacity for doing good, but a person is free to act, or not to act, in a righteous way. Pelagius gave an example of eyes. They have capacity for seeing, but a person can make either good or bad use of it. Like Jovinian, Pelagians insisted that human affections and desires were not touched by the fall either. Immorality, for example fornication, is exclusively a matter of will, that is, a person does not use natural desires in a proper way. In opposition to that, Augustine pointed out the apparent disobedience of the flesh to the spirit, and explained it as one of the results of original sin, punishment of Adam and Eve's disobedience to God. Augustine had served as a hearer for the Manichaeans for about 9 years, who taught that the original sin was carnal knowledge, but his struggle to understand the cause of evil in the world started before that, at the age of 19. By malum, evil, he understood most of all concupiscence, which he interpreted as a vice, dominating person, and causing in men and women moral disorder. Agostino Trappa insists that Augustine's personal experience cannot be credited for his doctrine about concupiscence. He considers Augustine's marital experience to be quite normal, and even exemplary, aside from the absence of Christian wedding rites. As J. Brachtendorf showed, Augustine used Ciceronian Stoic concept of passions to interpret Paul's doctrine of universal sin and redemption. The view that not only human soul, but also senses, were influenced by the fall of Adam and Eve, was prevalent in Augustine's time. Among the fathers of the Church, it is clear that the reason for Augustine's distancing from the affairs of the flesh was different from that of Plotinus, a Neoplatonist, who taught that only through disdain for fleshly desire could one reach the ultimate state of mankind. Augustine taught the redemption, that is, transformation and purification, of the body in the resurrection. Some authors perceive Augustine's doctrine as directed against human sexuality, and attribute his insistence on continence and devotion to God as coming from Augustine's need to reject his own highly sensual nature, as described in the Confessions. But in view of his writings, it is apparently a misunderstanding. Augustine taught that human sexuality has been wounded, together with the whole of human nature, and requires redemption of Christ. That healing is a process realized in conjugal acts. The virtue of continence is achieved thanks to the grace of the sacrament of Christian marriage, which becomes therefore a remedium concupiscentiae, remedy of concupiscence. The redemption of human sexuality will be, however, fully accomplished only in the resurrection of the body. The sin of Adam is inherited by all human beings. Already in his pre-Pelagian writings, Augustine taught that original sin is transmitted to his descendants by concupiscence, which he regarded as the passion of both soul and body, making humanity a massa damnata, that is, mass of perdition, condemned crowd, and much enfeebling, though not destroying, the freedom of the will. Augustine's formulation of the doctrine of original sin was confirmed at numerous councils, that is Carthage, Ephesus, Orange, Trenton by popes, that is Pope Innocent I, and Pope Zosimus. Anselm of Canterbury established, in his Cardias Homo, the definition that was followed by the great 13th century schoolmen, namely that original sin is the privation of the righteousness which every man ought to possess, thus separating it from concupiscence, with which some of Augustine's disciples had defined it, as later did Luther and Calvin. In 1567, Pope Pius V condemned the identification of original sin with concupiscence.
Predestination. Augustine taught that God orders all things while preserving human freedom. Prior to 396, he believed that predestination was based on God's foreknowledge of whether individuals would believe, that God's grace was a reward for human assent. Later, in response to Pelagius, Augustine said that the sin of pride consists in assuming that we are the ones who choose God, or that God chooses us, in his foreknowledge, because of something worthy in us, and argue that God's grace causes individual act of faith. Scholars are divided over whether Augustine's teaching implies double predestination, or the belief that God chooses some people for damnation, as well as some for salvation. Catholic scholars tend to deny that he held such a view, while some Protestants and secular scholars have held that Augustine did believe in double predestination. Some Protestant theologians, such as Justo L. Gonzalez and Bengt Haugland, interpret Augustine's teaching that grace is irresistible, results in conversion, and leads to perseverance. In On Rebuke and Grace, Augustine wrote, "And what is written, that he wills all men to be saved, while yet all men are not saved, may be understood in many ways, some of which I have mentioned in other writings of mine, but here I will say one thing, he wills all men to be saved, is so said that all the predestinated may be understood by it, because every kind of men is among them." Sacramental theology. Also in reaction against the Donatists, Augustine developed a distinction between the regularity and validity of the sacraments. Regular sacraments are performed by clergy of the Catholic Church, while sacraments performed by schismatics are considered irregular. Nevertheless, the validity of the sacraments do not depend upon the holiness of the priests who perform them, ex opere operato. Therefore, irregular sacraments are still accepted as valid, provided they are done in the name of Christ, and in the manner prescribed by the Church. On this point, Augustine departs from the earlier teaching of Cyprian, who taught that converts from schismatic movements must be rebaptized. Augustine taught that sacraments administered outside the Catholic Church, the true sacraments, avail nothing. However, he also stated that baptism, while it does not confer any grace when done outside the Church, does confer grace as soon as one is received into the Catholic Church. Augustine upheld the early Christian understanding of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, saying that Christ's statement, "This is my body," referred to the bread he carried in his hands, and that Christians must have faith that the bread and wine are, in fact, the body and blood of Christ, despite what they see with their eyes. Against the Pelagians, Augustine strongly stressed the importance of infant baptism, about the question whether baptism is an absolute necessity for salvation. However, Augustine appears to have refined his beliefs during his lifetime. causing some confusion among later theologians about his position. He said in one of his sermons that only the baptized are saved. This belief was shared by many early Christians. However, a passage from his City of God, concerning the apocalypse, may indicate that Augustine did believe in an exception for children born to Christian parents.
Thank you for listening to our episode, Rob Anderson Overnight. This episode featured a reading about the theologian Augustine from the folks at Wikipedia. We'd like to know what you think. Please share your thoughts and responses, and join us for a future episode.